With that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Benjamin Saulsberry from the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. Benjamin Saulsberry currently serves as the Public Engagement and Museum Education Director at the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. Since 2017, he has talked to thousands of visitors from all over the world about the work of the Emmett Till Memorial Commission and their commitment toward the creation of racial harmony in Sumner, Mississippi and surrounding areas. He's also served on a number of panel discussions concerning race, racism, and racial reconciliation, as well as being the keynote speaker for various events, one of which being Harvard Law's annual celebration of the Mississippi Delta in November of 2017, and the Black History Convocation at the University of Detroit at Mercy in February of 2019. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Benjamin.
So allow me to again thank you, Kate, and everyone for attending this event. On behalf of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center and my colleagues and those that are a part of this work, we are truly grateful and honored and privileged to be able to speak with you this evening concerning that of one, the life and legacy of Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley, but then also where we find ourselves in proximity to this narrative and what that means today, right? What that means when we talk about, quote unquote, the work. So having said that, I think it's only fitting that I give a little bit of context to the Emmett Till narrative. My assumption, well, I don't want to assume anything, and this isn't a downplay on anyone's intellect or knowledge concerning this narrative, but to be safe. Emmett Till was born, July 25th, 1941 in Chicago, Illinois. His mother, now the late Mamie Till-Mobley, is actually a Mississippi Delta native. She was born in Webb, Mississippi. So Webb is approximately 2 miles south of Sumner. And with that, Mamie Till, Mamie, or Mrs. Till, rather, Mrs. Till-Mobley, actually had family in the Sumner area or in Tallahatchie County. So Tallahatchie County is the county for which Sumner, Webb, and other places are, and for which Mrs. Till-Mobley had family. But when she was around 2 years old or close to 3 years old, her and her immediate family moved to a suburb of Chicago, Summit to be exact, affectionately known as Argo, Illinois, I think in large part because of the huge factory, the Argo factory plant that was there in the earlier 20th century. Her family participated along with a host of others in the Great Migration. As you all already know, the Great Migration took place in the early 20th century, in part as a means and ways for African Americans to achieve greater economic opportunity, but also very matter of fact to find a safe haven and rest from the harsh, oppressive environment of the South. And that's not to say that racism was exclusive to the southern region of this country, but nonetheless, some of the most, I guess, overt and harshest histories and patterns concerning racism absolutely prevailed in the South. And as such, you had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of African Americans to sojourn to states in the Midwest. So some of those states absolutely include Illinois and Indiana and Michigan and St. Louis and others. And as a result, or rather within that narrative, Mamie Till's family also did the same, or rather Mamie and her immediate family did the same. And so let's now again go back to now July 25th, 1941, Emmett is born. It is believed that Emmett actually had a relatively not so easy delivery. And as a child, he was actually stricken with polio, but thankfully he survived and thrived in spite of it, with the only affects being one, a pronounced stutter, and two, a limp. And so when we think about Emmett Till, I think a lot of times we immediately create this mythological martyr, right? That this child, was destined to change the world. But in fact, this was simply a child. And from the words of Mamie herself, she of course acknowledged and loved her child, but she also spoke very matter of factly of how much of a child he was. and he was her beloved son. But having said those things, it's extremely important to remember that we are talking about a young man, a very young man, for whom, unfortunately, his life would be taken from us or from him at the age of 14. But again, going back and setting the stage a little. So Emmett, I think, contrary to popular belief, actually visited Mississippi more than once. Needless to say, his final visit at the age of 14 would be the first time he visits as an adolescent, right? As a person making that transition from childhood or boyhood to now becoming or being a young adult. And so, speaking very matter-of-factly about this event, it was during the summer of '55, the latter part of August, where actually his cousin, Wheeler Parker, who's also from Summit and is also a Delta native in his own right, was slated to come to Mississippi for the last few weeks of summer, or rather the last few weeks before school would start. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. And when Emmett heard that his favorite cousin was going to come to Mississippi, he had to come with Wheeler as well. Now, again, I want to uplift the fact that at this time, Emmett was now 14 years old. He was a relatively fresh 14-year-old, his birthday having been July 25th, and this date now approximately around August 19th, August 20th, wherein he's getting ready to make his arrival into Mississippi. And like any parent or any caregiver, and one who has great concern, Emmett's mother was very mindful of the climate and of the environment, the hostile environment that he would be, that he would find himself in when we talk about Mississippi. And so she, of course, took time to warn him, right, to be very mindful of how he interacted with his white counterparts, to be very intentional in saying, yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and yes, sir, and no, sir, and not looking white folks in the eye when he talked to them, and even going so far as to cross the street to allow them clear passage. And that's something I think we kind of take for granted today. When we look at our own, when we look at the way we interact with one another and some of the liberties we have, or rather rights we have. Unfortunately, those things did not exist so much so in Mississippi, and the argument could be made in other places. But having said that, again, Emmett's mother being very mindful of those things, she shared that with her son. And of course, as we all know, he would make his arrival into Mississippi, if memory serves me correctly, on August 21st, along with Wheeler Parker, and he stayed in the home of Mose Wright. So Mose Wright is Mamie Till's, or rather Mamie Till-Mobley's, uncle, and as a result, that would be Emmett's great uncle. And so he stayed in the home of Mose Wright. So Mose Wright was a retired preacher from the Mississippi Delta. At the time, he lived in Money, Mississippi, and Money, Mississippi is a town about 15 miles or so north of Greenwood. It's a relatively small town. And again, Mose Wright lived in Money. And so days in the visit, like literally about 3 days into their visit, on August 24th, 1955, Emmett, along with Wheeler Parker and others, make their arrival into Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. And so this is the store. This is the place where Emmett, would whistle at Carolyn Bryant, or rather the storefront where Emmett would later whistle at Carolyn Bryant as she walked by. So speaking very matter-of-factly about this part of the narrative, and I want to be very clear that what I'm sharing is basically a paraphrase of what Reverend Wheeler Parker has shared on several occasions, and to some extent what the late Simeon Wright has shared, and what I and others have heard them share, right, in real time and in person. And so I think it's important to uplift that, because frankly, I wasn't there, right? And none of us were. And so to have folks of working memory and witness to these events is so pivotal and so critical when we think, when we intentionally remember and as we reckon with the truth and with history. And I would be an error to not uplift that and not share that with you all. So having said that, there are things that Reverend Wheeler Parker has absolutely refuted. And one of the things has been primarily what's shared in the more popular narrative around Emmett being goaded or dared into going into the store because Carolyn Bryant was a relatively attractive woman, right? So as y'all already know that, or as y'all have probably heard, there was this story that when Emmett made his arrival at the store or at the storefront, there were others already outside, some of whom playing checkers, some of whom loitering, things of that nature. And basically, as the, I'm going to say the myth, or as the misconception or misinformation has been spread, there was a conversation or ongoing conversations concerning, concerning Carolyn Bryant to some extent. And in some kind of way, we don't even really know how, but in some kind of way, it has been shared that Emmett said, I talk to white women all the time, and I have a white girlfriend, and things of that nature. And as a result of those statements, one of the locals then basically dared him to go into the store. Again, based off of what has been shared with us by Reverend Willa Parker, he said that frankly, Emmett just went into the store to get candy and bubble gum because he just, wanted some candy and bubble gum. And so Emmett goes into the store to retrieve his items. It's believed that Emmett was in the store for approximately 1 minute, along with Mrs. Carolyn Bryant. So Carolyn Bryant at the time was 21 years old, and she and her husband ran Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. So Emmett and Mrs. Bryant, or Emmett and Carolyn, were in the store for about a minute by themselves. When that time lapsed, if memory serves me correctly, Simeon, his uncle of 12 years old, went in to make sure that everything was okay. And as Simeon enters, he's basically seeing the completion of the transaction, right? And so Emmett gets his candy and bubble gum, and they walk off without much of a problem, or without any problem. And so, kind of convening back to the group, Carolyn Bryant then walks out. Based off of what has been shared with us in person, there was no interaction between Emmett and Mrs. Bryant that warranted fear or alarm or alert of any sort. That Mrs. Bryant went outside to her vehicle or to a vehicle for whatever reason. And it's as she walks by that Emmett whistles, right? And by whistling, I mean he does the woof whistle. I'm not gonna woof whistle because I ain't really that good at it. But for those, and depending on who's in this audience, y'all may be kind of a bit too young to remember this. But back in the day, like we had like cartoons like Tom and Jerry, and sometimes Bugs Bunny and other Warner Brothers characters. Well, Tom and Jerry isn't a Warner Brothers character, but you get the gist. You would have a character that would do a whistle, right? The woo woo, but it's not a woo, so it's a whistle. So Emmett whistles as this lady walks by. Him not thinking much of it. The folks around him, however, are petrified, right? They are scared out of their minds because they know that that Emmett at this point had just committed like a cardinal sin in some ways. It was absolutely forbidden for a black male to make an advance of any sort to a white woman, let alone married. Not that it would have mattered. And so, with that being said, and as Emmett saw the abject fear on the face of everyone else, they then decide to drive off as fast as they can, right? And so, as they drive off, they believe they're now being pursued by somebody, and as a result, they pull over into one of the nearby fields and they disperse. To their delightful surprise, the vehicle that was behind them continued on their path, not giving them another thought. And as those that were in the vehicle reconvened, those being Emmett and Simeon Wright. Well, Simeon actually stayed in the car the whole time. Willa Parker, and I believe another relative, and possibly a young lady, and whose name I forget at the moment. And I may be mistaken in that. I know that Willa Parker has shared with us that a young lady told them that basically the Bryants had a reputation for being, cruel to black folks, and that they hadn't heard the end of this. But basically, for whomever convened in the vehicle, right, when they got back together, Emmett begged them. He begged them not to tell Mose Wright or Uncle Mose about what happened, because he knew that the moment Uncle Mose knew what was going on, there was a very good chance that he and Willa Parker would be sent back to Chicago immediately. So this happens on a Wednesday evening at approximately 7:30 p.m. So you fast forward, right? Thursday night comes and goes, and Friday night comes and goes. And you're now, it's Saturday. Now, looking back at this narrative, or looking back at the time of this event, Roy Bryant was actually out of town. He was on a freelance job in Texas, and he made his arrival. I believe he came back into town very early Saturday, if not late Friday night. Now, this is important because from Wednesday evening to now Saturday, arguably Saturday morning, this story is now being disseminated amongst folks that were present, but may not have been in very close proximity to Emmett whistling. And now folks that were on the ground, but not very close at all to anything. And now that goes from whoever was there to any and everybody that heard a version of what happened. I share this because the truth of the matter is we don't know exactly who told Roy Bryant what happened first. We do know that Roy Bryant would go on to confront Carolyn Bryant, his wife. And as a result, she would then basically tell him whatever she shared. And then he and his brother, J.W. Milam, would go on, would literally look for Emmett Till for the remainder of the day. It's been reported that they actually found a young man that, at least to some extent, fit the description of Emmett Till, but when they found out that he wasn't the person for whom had committed, this heinous act against his wife and or brother-in-law or sister-in-law rather, they threw this child, they literally threw this child off the back of the pickup truck. And so while they're still in pursuit of Emmett and some of his relatives, some of his young, his peers and relatives go to Greenwood that evening. So Greenwood again being like, being the nearest town and the most prominent town for social events, be they parties, be they, juke joints, be they whatever you're kind of into. Greenwood was the place that folks went to, especially on Saturday night. And so after an evening of fun and whatnot, Emmett, along with Willa Parker and one of their other relatives, they make their way back to Mose Wright's home. It's safe to say that at this point, the events of Wednesday evening have kind of, they've mentally distanced themselves from those things, because well over 3 days now has passed, and for whatever reason, they didn't give it much thought after that. So they make their arrival back to the home of Mose Wright at approximately 2:30. Well, I'm lying. I'm sorry. At around midnight, give or take. But at approximately 2:30 in the morning, so this is August 28th, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam come to the home or come to the porch of Mose Wright, and they enter with flashlights and firearms in hand. And they basically demand to speak to, or rather they ask for the boy that did all the talking, that child being Emmett. And they would go on to quite literally take this child out of the bed he's sleeping and force him to get dressed and follow them into their vehicle, into the pickup truck of J.W. Milam. Now, it's somewhat speculative as to whether or not Carolyn Bryant was in the truck during the abduction, right? During the time that this, that Emmett was taken out of the home. We don't know for certain, but there's a good reason to believe she was. And I'll get to that shortly. So August 28th, 2:30 a.m., Emmett is taken out of the home of Mose Wright, and they drive off into the cloak of night. And as you all already know, Emmett is never seen alive again. But at August 31st, which is that following Wednesday, I believe around noon, a body is discovered in the Tallahatchie River. And as law enforcement is informed of this body being recovered, or rather being discovered, Tallahatchie County is also informed for whatever reason. And the body is now recovered on the Tallahatchie side, this being a demand from Sheriff Strider of Tallahatchie County. And as such, Mr. Mose Wright is contacted, and he goes to the riverbank, or he goes to the recovery site. And basically he and his family are able to make a positive identification that this, in fact, is the body of their loved one, of 14-year-old Emmett Till. So not long after the body is recovered, there is an immediate burial on the now on the church grounds of East Money Church of God in Christ. So this is the church for which this is the church for which Reverend Mose Wright, or Preacher Mose Wright, he was a retired minister at this time. And so as the burial is taking place, and as Mrs. Till, as Emmett's mother is being informed, and updated, on the developments and on a body being recovered and them believing it was Emmett and things of that nature, she very matter of factly was able to have the burial halted, and then demanded that the body of her son be sent back to Chicago so that, she herself could basically do a personal autopsy. Now, this is important. I mean, not that any of these details aren't, but it's extremely important to note that from a cultural standpoint, a lot of times, if and when Black folk were murdered, one of the ways for which a body would be disposed would be by way of drowning, right? Or by way of water submersion. Some of that was because, well, frankly, not being able to have a body gives way to questioning whether or not a person was murdered, at least in a Jim Crow era. But another way or another reason that's, just in my opinion, much more matter of fact, was because, frankly, you had folks that were, that just didn't see a problem in drowning folk and killing folk and not worrying if a body would ever turn up. So having said those things, so this body, this child is murdered. This child is, the burial takes place, and then the burial is stopped. And now the body is sent to two morticians. The latter being that of Mr. Woodrow Champ Jackson. So Champ Jackson is an African-American mortician that worked at the time for the Tutwiler Funeral Home. So Tutwiler is another town that's about 4.5 miles north of Sumner. Another really quick point I want to note is that at that time, when it comes to the recovery of a body and the caretaking of a body, typically, if or when the victim is African American, an African American undertaker or mortician would be the one contacted, and if a victim or person was white, then basically you would find a white mortician. That was, customs and practice. And so there was no hesitation in contacting a Black undertaker, or rather Black morticians, to work on the body of Emmett Till. Now, this is important because in a little bit, you'll see an interesting contradiction that takes place during the trial. So the body is shipped, I believe, from Tutwiler straight to Chicago, with strict instructions from the state of Mississippi not to open the remains, right? Not to open the contents, rather. And maybe Mrs. Mobley basically said, forget that. I'm going to see, the remains of my child. And she does. She's able to get the coffin opened or broken into, for lack of a better way of putting it. And she performs a personal autopsy. And so on that note, or rather, as a result of that, she then makes the determination to have an open casket funeral. And the now famous quote from Mrs. Mamie Till-Mobley was that, and I'm going to paraphrase though, was that she wanted the world to see what happened to her son. She wanted the world to see, just how ugly and how vitriol racism is. She wanted the world to not just see, but now not have any way and any merit of dismissing how absolutely evil racism is. Now, this is important because I don't think it was much of a mystery to most folks as to whether or not bad things were happening to Black folks back then, especially. And it's relatively easy, well, for the person that chooses to dismiss the hurt and harm of a person because there isn't evidence or there isn't a body recovered, to that individual that's looking for a way and a reason to dismiss the claims of racism being, again, so brutal and so decadent. Not having a body was the easy way out for a lot of folks to dismiss it. And so Mamie Till, being very well aware of that, made it a point to not allow that to happen to her son. And so with that being said, or with that decision being made, an open casket funeral was held for Emmett Till. And this funeral lasted for approximately 4 days. Now, there have been estimates on the low end being that of 50,000 people, I believe possibly on the very first day of him lying in wake, to upwards of around 250,000 people witnessing this child laying in wake in Chicago at Robert Semple Church of God in Christ. Excuse me. And so I believe the Chicago Defender says upwards of around 250,000. Most other articles and other sources have placed the viewing total in the area in the estimate around 100,000. But needless to say, a considerable amount of people took time to witness the body of Emmett Till laying in wake. But we also know that as a result of him laying in wake, or his body in wake, the world now is exposed to the image of this child by way of Jet magazine. And so this image is disseminated in this very prominent African-American publication. And now for the first time, I think maybe ever, Black America as a whole, and in some ways, America as a whole, has to reckon with the realities of racism. That now there's no way that we as a society can dismiss, the hurt and the pain and the almost centuries of Black death at the hands of not just a white person, but of a system and a construct that chose to and perpetuated the dismissal of the humanity of Black people. And Emmett Till, unfortunately, became, in some ways, the poster child for this. As you all know, so this happened the very, very early September. I want to say the funeral, I believe it started on September 3rd and kind of ended around September 6th. Interestingly enough, the trial began September 19th. So to put that into context, we go from the recovery of his body August 31st, and I'm just going to choose to kind of fast forward a little bit, into the not guilty verdict being rendered around September 23rd. In less than a month, you have a murder trial being held and being completed in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. That is unheard of and unprecedented. Now, in some ways, it's kind of miraculous that a trial at all was held when we look at historical practices and we look at customs and things of that nature in the Jim Crow era, and absolutely so when we talk about Mississippi. Whole other thing, however, having said that and acknowledging that, there's no way to dismiss the lack of due diligence that this family, that this mother deserved when it comes to an appropriate, let alone an equitable and fair investigation that should have been rendered. And in spite of that, you had people like Medgar Evers and others that worked tirelessly to help the prosecution create arguments, viable, valid arguments, in the face of what some have deemed, a farce of a trial. Now, I kind of want to open it up some, so allow me to kind of expedite this a little bit more. So you have the not guilty verdict rendered in September 23rd, if I remember correctly. And this is important because during the trial, Mamie Till-Mobley, Emmett's mother, is in Mississippi, and she's given safe haven by a gentleman for whom is Dr. T.R.M. Howard. Now, T.R.M. Howard is a man from Mount Bayou, Mississippi. Mount Bayou is about 40 miles west of Sumner. And Black Bayou has a lot of historical precedence, in large part because it was one of the first, if not the first, town in Mississippi founded and colonized in a lot of ways, or rather founded, by former enslaved Africans or enslaved folks. And Dr. T.R.M. Howard was able to, thrive in Mount Bayou. This is a man that, he was a practicing physician, surgeon. He was also an entrepreneur that owned an insurance company, and I believe he even had like a zoo or a petting zoo, and a host of other things that I would encourage you to check out at your own volition. But another thing to note about Dr. Howard was that he was he was dogged in his pursuit of seeing Black folks be respected and treated right. And so by that, on that note, he was an activist, and very prolific figure in having the NAACP be involved with this case and with this trial. And when this not guilty verdict was rendered, Dr. Howard took it on himself to go on a mission to share with various NAACP chapters all over the Southeast about what happened to Mamie Till-Mobley and her child. So having said that, in November, same year, Dr. Howard was given an audience by the NAACP chapter in Montgomery, Alabama, that was headed up by Dr. Martin King Jr. at the time, and for whom NAACP not civil rights, but NAACP Secretary Rosa Parks was also in the audience, or was also in attendance to Dr. Howard sharing the Emmett Till tragedy. So this is the latter part of November, I think November 27th, where he speaks. And you fast forward, and Rosa Parks then chooses not to give up her seat, right? I think this was December 1st, if I remember correctly. Consequently, in the following month, right, January 1 begins the bus boycott of Montgomery, which goes on for an entire year and about 20 some odd days. Now, I want to be very clear that by no means am I saying that because of Emmett Till's death, Rosa Parks decided to not get up and then spontaneously everybody decided to do the bus boycott of Montgomery. Like, no, there was some real planning and some strategy in place when it comes to the bus boycott of Montgomery. But what I will say absolutely is that because Dr. T.R.M. Howard made it a point, or rather made it his mission to share what was going on in Mississippi, and very matter of factly what happened with Emmett Till and others, but definitely Emmett Till, that absolutely spoke to the mind and heart of Rosa Parks and Dr. King and many others, some of whom have even spoken to that directly. Rosa Parks being one, many years later, being asked basically what motivated her, right? Like why did she choose to stay seated? And her response in pausing was that she thought about Mamie Till-Mobley and she thought about Emmett, and she just couldn't get up, right? If I remember correctly, her more precise words were, I thought about Emmett and I was just tired. But having said those things, it's not hyperbole that the unfortunate death and murder of Emmett Till inspired so many others. And so when we look at this narrative, it absolutely is the preamble to the civil rights movement. It has absolute connections to the modern civil rights movement. For example, the March on Washington in '63. Well, the date of that was August 28th, 1963. Not saying that it's a matter of fact that it was through deliberate intention or planning on the part of Dr. King and others to have it on the 5th year anniversary of the abduction and murder of Emmett Till. But I do think it's a coincidence worth noting. You also have very prominent figures, African Americans, for whom have attributed Emmett Till as a chief motivator in some of the things that they went on to do. Two of whom being, one, the late, John Lewis, but then another being, global icon, in some ways, global humanitarian, Muhammad Ali. If memory serves me correctly, Muhammad Ali was actually, I think him and Emmett shared a birthday, although I think Emmett may have been a year, I can't remember if he was a year younger or older than Muhammad Ali, but Muhammad Ali has spoken on several occasions of how he remembered seeing Emmett lying, in the state that he was in, and he said, I paraphrasing, he saw himself, right, and he wanted to do something, but he didn't know exactly what to do. And so, to some extent, and we all know that Muhammad Ali went on to, to consistently speak on behalf of equity for Black folk and on behalf of the importance of Black folk being empowered and being respected. And that's no small feat, or no small part rather, to the influence that Emmett Till had on him. So I haven't talked too much about the organization, and so I think what I'm going to do is allow I think we can open up the floor for some questions to give way to the Interpretive Center, because Because although, we've kind of spent a considerable amount of time with context to the narrative, I think it's very important also to kind of share how and why the Emmett Till Interpretive Center exists and how that, we already shared how. But I want to really kind of open up the floor for some dialogue, because it's one thing to hear me talk, right? It's one thing for me to share and this and that, but I think growth and I think the process of being better happens when there are opportunities given for us to exchange and for us to have dialogue. So on that note, Ms. Kate, I'm gonna let you kind of help when I kind of help. I'm gonna ask and plead that you help moderate, facilitate some of the questions that may have been raised, or if some have already, if anyone submitted some prior to us getting to the Q&A.
We don't have any questions in the chat or Q&A yet, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box at the bottom or in the chat. I will convey those up to Benjamin. And I had a starting question, and this might be more towards what you do, your work in the Interpretive Center. But what can we do to ensure that the full story of Emmett Till and the civil rights movement is told, and told in the way that you described it, that there was planning and momentum, and it was a whole network of people across the whole United States, and not kind of how the elementary school method tells it, where it's just kind of a series of coincidences that snowballed into a big movement. So what are things that can be done, should be done, to start breaking down the myth, telling the story of the real man rather than the myth?
Oh, that's a really great question, Kate. So what I'm going to share is my opinion, right? Because I have what I think, but just because I think it don't mean it's absolute. Well, I don't think what I'm going to say is bad response. So on that note, I think there are a few approaches that we can, and there are should take as we work to be good stewards of truth. And part of that is really, again, looking at stewardship, understanding that I think in this society, ownership is often given a huge emphasis and platform, but in what ways how do you prove ownership of a thing outside of the exchange of a currency or this or that? And I don't think something like this should be owned, because ownership speaks, and there has some connotations to to control and to dominance and or things of that nature. And I think we have to move away from a place of controlling, and instead come into a place where where we realize that we're sharing space, that society is made up of all of us. And so, having said those things, I think one, it's imperative to find ways to do what we're doing tonight, right? Like what we did, although this event is being held now for like an hour and a half, we've been discussing and reading and researching, for a few months, and that's just for a web event, right? That speaks to the amount of time that speaks to the amount of deliberate intention that has to be given when we look at finding the best ways to share these narratives, right? And finding the best ways to come into spaces of truth. And I think that's universal. And by that, I mean, I think just as sure as, folks like ourselves, and by ourselves, I mean our institutions and those that are viewing, have chosen to give place to hearing something that they may have heard 100 times, but probably haven't heard it like this. I think that same thing, or a thing very similar, has to now become a part of what we do as a culture, right? What we do as a society, and as folks that really do just want to be somewhat decent human beings. I think doing that will then absolutely calls for research. It calls for as close to unbiased research as possible. And I want to uplift that, because frankly, we all have some, we have biases. And that's not a bad thing per se. It's only bad when you're not willing to recognize that they exist, and or when you choose to allow your bias or biases to now control or dictate how you go about coming into a narrative, and how and how you'll accept or embrace a narrative or parts of a narrative, which then goes back to that whole stewardship thing. Because if I'm a steward, then I know out the gate that it's not mine. I'm simply caretaking for others, and I'm caretaking for quite possibly the next steward, because I won't be here forever. And I think we have to have that mindset, because, or need a mindset similar to that, because we have young folks and others that are coming after us, or really not even after us, but are coming along with us, and they have to do a better job than we did. They have to be, and it has to be modeled. We have to be willing, to have those hard conversations with one another, and to do it more than once. I think when we look at meaningful, somewhat measurable change of any sort and type, that has almost always come about by way of people choosing over and over again to come into a place of commonality, to come into a place of equity, and or create those spaces of equity. And when I say equity in this context, I mean looking at the stuff that isn't often talked about when we look at the civil rights movement. I think sometimes, it's very easy to uplift Dr. Martin Luther King, and rightly so, and Rosa Parks and Medgar Evers and a whole bunch of other folk, and that's good. But I think in the same vein, we have to acknowledge the fact that the success of the civil rights movement was built off of the millions of people who never made the history books, and built off of the smaller network of folks that were on the ground that Dr. King and others contacted, because they knew that these were the go-to people in these neighborhoods or in these regions or these areas that could give housing for hundreds or thousands, and could feed hundreds and thousands, and could then, share, a car ride or a bus or whatever. But all of that really, goes back into understanding the importance of us stewarding or being stewards of the narrative or of these narratives, which means, since as a person desiring to be a good steward, I'm now going to do the best I can to exhaust as many resources as possible when it comes to learning, so that other folks coming along with me are learning and in turn sharing. I know that sounds somewhat nuanced, but again, the opposite of that is what we've been doing, which is use, or at least growing up. Y'all probably have textbooks growing up, the folks that are viewing this probably. But like, we had old textbooks that had a paragraph on Emmett Till and a paragraph or a page or two on Dr. King, wherein now we literally have, volumes of information at our fingertips. And what has to happen now, because of the excess of information, is we have to be willing to find those, who are good stewards of this information, and glean from them, right? And learn with them, and then find ways to introduce them into various audiences and spaces, share that information and knowledge, and then continue to do the same going forward. Like, knowledge, like being a lifelong learner, has to become a part of who and what we are as a society if we're going to get this quote unquote right.
Great. And we had a few questions come in while in the meantime, so thank you. So we have one question. I believe Carolyn Bryant more recently said that she never recanted or said she lied about the original accusation. How do you think we should incorporate that, or not, into our discussion with people about Emmett Till and what happened to him?
Yeah, that's a great question. So very matter of fact, when we look at the trial, Mrs. Bryant took the stand, and she basically said Emmett did, these horrible things, right? She said that Emmett made very sexually charged comments to her, that he, basically, aggressed her or groped her, things of that nature. And in Timothy Tyson's Blood of Emmett Till, which was published in 2017, he kind of states, it stated that she says, that didn't happen. And then not long after that, I think her family or herself made a statement saying, I don't remember any of that, right? So she literally recanted on the recant. Now, to put that into context, in the mid 2000s, there was an active federal well, for the first time, you had a federal investigation for the Emmett Till murder going on. And she was a person of question, right? And so when she was, I don't want to say interrogated, but when the feds asked her some questions, paraphrasing, she basically said, "I don't remember," or "I don't know," things of that sort. And then, here comes Timothy Tyson's book, many years later, kind of stating that she probably did know a little more than she told the feds. Now, this is important because, frankly, it is, it's a crime to lie to the feds. Now, I want to be crystal clear that I'm not promoting anybody to lie to law enforcement under any circumstances, federal or not. But having said that, it's frowned upon to lie to your, to like your municipal officers and things of that nature. You can do time for lying to federal officers during an investigation. Now, this is important because, again, when we're looking at narrative, when we're looking at when we're looking at practices, this is a person for whom is a part of this historical narrative. In some ways has evaded justice, although it is it's fair to question to what extent, she is quote unquote guilty, and or what role she absolutely played outside of what we know she shared in court, and or what has been expressed by way of various publications. But I think being able to say that is important because, again, this narrative, or it's not even just a narrative, but this occurrence in our national story is one that does not impact just one person and just one family. This story is one that has impacted all of us, although some far more so than others, or more directly than others. So with that being said, it's important to the best of our ability when we seek to speak accurately about these things, we need to be able to acknowledge the fact that Carolyn Bryant, up to this point, has not really been held accountable for whatever role she may have played in the abduction and or murder of Emmett Till. Right now, going back to something really, really quickly, we believe that she was used to identify Emmett. We don't know if she was used to identify Emmett on the grounds of Mose Wright's home. However, during the testimony that Mose Wright gave in the courthouse or in the courtroom, he said that, he absolutely, he know that Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were the ones that came to his home because, well, they announced themselves. And as they were getting ready to enter the truck after taking Emmett, they basically asked somebody in the truck who did not come into the house, whether or not this was the right one, or is this him? And whoever that was said yes, or something to the affirmative. Now, with that being said, Mose Wright basically, he didn't allude, he said that he believed that the voice sounded like a lady, right? Her voice was a little fair, like it was a little softer, like, he gave, his testimony concerning that other person that was in the truck would leave us to believe that a lady was the one that was used to identify Emmett. And so, again, somewhat speculative, but since we're not in court, although I'm kind of in a courtroom, it's not completely unfair to deduct or deduce, rather, that the person in that truck was Carolyn Bryant. Because if it wasn't Carolyn Bryant, who would have the authority to say, very matter of factly, this is the right person at 2:30 in the morning in a vehicle that belonged to, her brother-in-law, right? So those, so she has a role and a part in this narrative, whether we like it or not. But I think the other thing to remember is, although it does need to be acknowledged that, Carolyn Bryant being 21 years old and being, not having a voice, or the voice that she should have just by right of being a human being, but looking at the time, there were certain things that she said and did, in part because her husband and her defense team told her to and made her do it. The other thing is, when we look at society as a whole, one of the worst things in the world for a white person, one of the worst things that can happen to a white person, especially a white woman, is to be labeled, I'm going to say, a sympathizer. And there's some other terms that are a little bit more accurate and a little bit more coarse when we talk about, or when we look at how society perpetuated the divisions concerning Black and white folk. Now, she didn't help matters much by getting up in line because as an adult, she did have a choice. Although, having said that, the choices she had absolutely had consequences that very well could have and would have ostracized her, if not gotten her harmed. But sometimes, truth be told, sometimes you have to be willing to pay the full consequence and price of being right. Because frankly, you run the risk of doing great harm to a multitude of other people when you don't. And this isn't me sympathizing for her per se. You know, whatever guilt or whatever role she has played in this, I think if justice exists in any kind of way, shape, or form, if nothing else, people should be aware, people should know it matter of factly. And whether or not we will, I don't know. But I think when we look at her as a person, not just as a character, but as a person for whom is part of this narrative, those are some of the things to take into account and to share.
Great. So we have a few more. I will interject with this short one. Will we see elements of the courthouse that you were in, the courtroom?
Absolutely. So if my little phone does right, because I am on my phone, I'm gonna try to do the little flip screen thingy. So you have data that I am. Yeah. So this section here, being the jury section, I hope y'all can see this. This is basically where the jury sat. As y'all probably already know, this jury was comprised of an all-white, all-male jury with 6 alternates. These gentlemen were from Tallahatchie County, of course, and they deliberated for an hour and 6 minutes in this behind those doors. So these 12 men basically came to the conclusion that that J.W. Monument and Roy Bryant were not guilty, and they shared that not guilty verdict literally an hour and 6 minutes after deliberation. When they were asked why did it, why that time lapse, they basically said, well, it probably wouldn't have taken us that long if we hadn't stopped for Cokes and sandwiches. So having said that, I want to kind of highlight this little but this banister / balcony, also, the bar. It actually predates the trial. So this courtroom and this courthouse was built, I want to say 1903, and I believe this is the original balcony, one of the few original pieces in the courtroom. And so this balcony was here, or banister rather, was here during the trial. Almost everything else, unfortunately may not be the appropriate word. A lot of the things here again were part of a restoration work from the Memorial Commission. And we believe that it was of the utmost importance to try to restore this space as close to the way it did to the way it was in 55 as possible, because frankly, we need to be constantly reminded of who and what we are. And that although it's good and great that we're not at the mercy of our past, if you don't remember where you come from, right? If you don't remember, even the hard truths about your journey, you do run the risk of taking for granted the liberties that exist at present. So let's see something else. Oh, so looking at the walls, not walls, but looking at the ceiling in 55, these little ceiling fans were not there, okay? In 55, there was actually only one large ceiling fan at the center of the ceiling. And so there was no air conditioning, definitely wasn't no central heating or cooling or anything like that. Certain days of the trial had upwards of 330 something people here. Now this is, Delta, Mississippi in September. You can imagine how hot it is. And that little thing I'm showing you right here, this is not a flower pot, ladies and gentlemen. This is a spittoon. So thankfully, one of the few things Mississippi has absolutely gotten right is the outlawing of tobacco in public spaces. Well, back in 55, it was not it wasn't outlawed, and a whole bunch of folks were chewing tobacco and using those spittoons to relieve the contents of their, of the chew. So we've even brought back the spittoons, which we didn't, but they were brought back, and in part, again, not just to kind of be touristy or to be cliche or anything like that, but to some extent, was our desire to be accurate and historically accurate when we remember this space and remember this narrative. But this space also now serves as a place of new of creating new narratives. This is a space very intentionally on the part of the Interpretive Center is used to do programming. And in the summer, we for the last few years, we've been able to have young people come into this space and share their own photo documentaries and other works within various mediums, using the arts as a means and ways of telling these stories and healing from past traumas. So the work of the Interpretive Center in part is that, right? Is to remember, is to uplift the memory and legacy of Emmett Till and Mamie Till-Mobley, but also to work to cultivate racial harmony here, but also in society at large, and doing that through various mediums. One being the arts, but then also through commemoration and through education, right? In K through 12 settings, and finding yet other ways to actually kind of live out how do we really, live the sorry that we gave on the courtyard steps in 2007 with the blessing of Willa Parker and now the late Simeon Wright. So I think I answered the question as far as some of the things in here. I mean, that was kind of like the important stuff, at least on this floor.
All right. And then this next question is kind of a two-part and will lead into your work in the Interpretive Center. So the first one is more of an opinion. What are your thoughts on the current movie / documentary about Mamie and Emmett Till? And then the second part is Mamie Till has a book, Death of Innocence, which a very powerful book. Does the Interpretive Center address or reference this book in its work?
Okay, great question. Both questions are great questions. So let's see. There was a great question, and I literally can't remember what the first question was, Kate. I'm having a
That's okay. I threw you two questions at once. What are your thoughts on the current movie and documentary about Mamie and Emmett Till? Yeah.
So as y'all already know, there is a show, a miniseries, Women of the Movement, that's playing on ABC every Thursday night and then available for Hulu or on Hulu the following day. So asking me personally, and these are the thoughts of Benjamin Saulsberry, although I do work with and for the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, what I'm sharing now is the exclusive thoughts of me. So anything to be levied against the next words that are going to be shared, please levy that on me and not the organization I work with. Yes, and I'm glad that's being recorded. So in a lot of ways, I think this miniseries I think it can do a lot of good. I say that because I think this miniseries has been, at least so far anyway, the episodes that I've witnessed have been done so well to cause discussions everywhere. Well, I don't know about everywhere because I can't see everywhere, but it's a whole lot of people talking, and not just talking about what folks wore or how folks talk, but they really are talking about, race and racism in a way that, even in my 37 years, I haven't seen on a large scale people really talk about. Even when we compare that to real life tragic, real time tragic events like George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, and things of that nature. So for this dramatic work to hold the attention of people in such a way to where we're talking consistently about this, and knowing that it's not just something somebody wrote up, that there is, that this happened. I think if done the right way by folks, like us, right? If we, a society at large, people that care, intentionally leverage this medium and this production, I think it can position us over the long term to continue to get people of various ages and socioeconomic backgrounds and all that to really think. Now, having said that, I have to say this, that I'm grateful that a large part of the source material was that of Devery Anderson's book, which I think originally came out in 2010. I think that was Emmett Till, the murder that shocked the world and caused the civil rights movement. I think that's the official name. So a lot of the material comes from that very comprehensive book. there are some things in it, by not the book, but rather in the Women of the Movement series that has aired that I won't say it run counters with the book, but there are things that I personally would have liked to have seen that I didn't see, and there were a couple of scenes in it where I really felt like they took some creative liberties. I think one case in point is the moment where Mose Wright is giving his testimony, and he points at J.W. Milam, and thankfully they say there he is, as opposed to there he, which he did not say. This was a man that spoke better English than me. This was a retired preacher, a gentleman for whom being recorded several times before and after, never used broken English. So for them to to preserve his dignity as a human being and as a man of thought and articulation was fair. It was the right thing to do. I'm glad they got that right. But what they showed, there was a part where he was being like cross-examined, right? And then he has this iRobot moment. I don't know if y'all seen iRobot, but when Sonny is being questioned by Will Smith, oh wow, the irony. Okay, anyway. And so like in iRobot, Sonny gets mad and says, I did not murder him. And he, calls a dent in his steel table. And so while now in Women of the Movement, when Mr. Mose Wright is being questioned, he gets mad and he has this outburst, this physical outburst of aggression on the witness stand. I don't know if that happened. I don't know if a 64-year-old African-American man for whose loved one was kidnapped, murdered, and is now being questioned in Sumner, Mississippi, in the presence of literally 300 plus white men, no matter how upset he is, and he is absolutely provoked. I question if he would have, in the midst of all of those things, he would have done that. Now that's me questioning. I can't say it did not happen, but in no account have I had in exchanging with folks and or in my reading or anything else, have I seen anyone give witness to him doing that. I think creative liberties were taken in certain parts of this show, and I think that was one of them. I say that because frankly, in real time and in real life, when Mose Wright after he gave his testimony, his home was raided, right? Like folks were literally looking for him to kill him and or his family because he pointed at J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant. So can you imagine what would have happened if this man, after having already pointed out J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant in court in Sumner, Mississippi, Tallahatchie County, now has this, aggressive outburst? I personally think that's a bit much. Now, it makes great TV, and it makes a great, point let's kind of look at and talk about. But whether or not that thing happened, I don't know. But again, when we're looking just at the essence of what this show has shared, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a point of learning for all of us, and I think it positions us to continue to dig a little deeper and have more meaningful conversations. There was a second part of your question. So yeah, the Death of Innocence is an absolute, it's not just a resource, it is, I believe it is a must read for, in my opinion, again, it needs to be a part of middle school on up literature. It needs to be a part of American literature to look at the mind and heart of this mother for whose pain, again, has placed us on the trajectory that we find ourselves. She is an icon, not by choice, but in spite of those things, she continued to make decisions that have really, in some ways, benefited us all at the cost and price of, the most precious part of herself in a lot of ways, and that's what she shared even in her book. So yeah, we absolutely uplift The Death of Innocence by Mamie Till, co-authored by Christopher Benson, who I think is a professor at Northwestern. So he ain't too far from y'all. Y'all might want to send him a hey, how you doing someday. But yeah, Death of Innocence is a must read, and a must read more than once at that.
Do you want to use that as a segue into your work in the Interpretive Center?
I'm happy to do that. Yes, ma'am. So as I stated at the beginning of this talk, I serve as a public engagement and museum ed director at the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. So what I do and what we aim to do at the center, or rather, just in this scope of work is we want to find ways to make people very aware of this narrative, right? But then also aware of the fact that in Tallahatchie County, in the mid 2000s, Black and white folk, after 50 plus years of silence, began talking about race and racism. And they did this through facilitation, right? The William Winters Institute is an organization that helps or assists communities that have been, dramatically and in some ways, traumatized by racism. So this absolutely fit us. And so those conversations were headed up by Miss Susan Glisson, who was the head of the who was the head of the William Winters Institute at the time. And so over the course of almost a year, this biracial committee or commission or convening wrestled with not just what an apology would look like, but what our community should look like and be comprised of years later. And what they realized was, that more had to be done than just restore a courtroom. That was fine and good to look at a place that had fallen into dilapidation and now choose to use it with intentionality, which includes its traditional use case or original use case of being a courthouse and courtroom, but also programming with young folks and others, and just being a part of our community and not just a symbol of a miscarriage of justice. Having said that, we realized that frankly, we need to create an organization on the day-to-day that shares this narrative and that works to find ways to continue to engage our community on a state level and any other level when it comes to reckoning with racism and when it comes to really looking very matter-of-factly at what steps we can take as a society, but also encourage other folks and other communities and other institutions and other entities to look inward and to be willing to look at the areas of growth when it comes to acknowledging the fact that we've all been impacted by racism. This nation, again, objectively speaking, in a lot of ways was founded by racism. Like, you don't get to 1776 without 1619. And I mean, and again, that's not a promotion of any cause per se, that's just the acknowledgement of history. And we have to choose to get to a place where we find the best vehicles for folks on whatever scale you want to measure that, to figure, to look, to have those open and honest conversations, not just around the past, not just around that one thing or those one bad points of identity within the community or within, well, however you identify community, but then choose to continue to come together and figure out ways going forward, what mechanisms can be placed to make your community healthy. And when I say community, I'm not just talking about a neighborhood or where you live. I'm talking about whatever places and points of convening and shared spaces exist. So you can have a work community or a school community or communities of faith or a number of other ways that you choose to identify community. What we aim to do is bring people to a place where they're now looking at some of the things we did and learning from the mistakes we made and carving out a path of their own towards equity and towards communal understanding. And again, that initially that started with commemoration. That started with our commission, our local body, finding resources to place markers at various sites that are part of the Emmett Till tragedy in our little neck of the woods. But it has grown into, again, this call locally, statewide, and nationally, to really do an honest investigation of our own minds and hearts, and to do it not to place blame on people or not to place blame on a system and or constructs, but to call a thing what it is. And then for folks that are willing to sit and stand and walk and work together, Black, white, and otherwise, or Black, white, and otherwise, for however long it takes, figure out the way you want your community to be, and then choose to be it. And that, I think, will culminate into policy change and will culminate into how certain things are taught and expressed in K through 12 settings as well as higher ed, and how that impacts the way law is interpreted be it through law enforcement and or even when it comes to litigation and protocols in courtrooms, everything else. Now, that's a lofty, high, dream, to be honest. But with that being said, we know I'm a living witness to the fact that when people choose to sit together and just reason with each other, not just to be politically correct and not just to be able to say, I'm better than my predecessor, but really sit and reason with one another because we owe it to each other and to those that are coming along with us. I think we increase the likelihood of actually creating, that more perfect union the founding fathers, wrote about so eloquently a long time ago.
Great. So I missed the context for this sentence or this question, unfortunately. Hopefully you can recall. So the question is, do you then dismiss the story as told in Look magazine that says Wright did indeed say that about the white men? So again, I can't provide any point of reference for when you said this, but.
So I can't remember if in Look magazine they said Darhe, but I know there was another writer that basically in their sharing of what happened in the courtroom, they said that Wright said Darhe when he pointed at J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant. I will go so far as to say when it comes to the Darhe, Benjamin Saulsberry, dismiss it every single time. Now, I want to share this too, that it's not completely, out of the realm of what's done often just by human nature. And in some ways, the deceptive part of human nature to intentionally give way to truth and lies. Because what happens, especially when a lie is very present, is, we have the unction to just then dismiss everything because this thing right here is a lie. And sometimes that's appropriate. But I think there are other times where, again, further vetting and further, or more time with a point of material and subject, deserves greater scrutiny. Having said that, look. So when we talk about Look magazine, period, not even just the potential Darhe part, but just the entirety of the Look magazine confession. Frankly, the only thing true about that confession is them acknowledging that they had a role in the abduction and murder. We know that, frankly, again, that what J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant said in that article, or in that article, they were paid. They got paid for that. And matter of fact, that even in '56, there was like a push for this to become a movie, and so they were trying really to kind of sell a script. And so their confession was kind of like a part of the push for a script. Having said those things, we know that J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant were not the only two folks that were part of the murder of Emmett Till. We know by way of deathbed confession that Leslie Milam, the brother to J.W. and Roy Bryant, was definitely the brother to J.W. Milam, gave them access to the barn shed outside of Drew, Mississippi, on Sturdy Vince Plantation. We also know that, what's his man's name? I think Kimball Short, if I remember right, who was like the best friend to J.W. Milam, was also present during the murder of Emmett Till and Drew. We believe there could have been anywhere between 4 to 6 people involved. But we know that without a shadow of a doubt, that the confession or the hyper confession given by J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant, were done because they had good reason to believe that there was no real public will to hold them accountable. Due to double jeopardy, they would not be able to be charged again, for the crime of murder, at least by the state. Now, if the feds were any good, I wasn't supposed to say it that way, but I said it. If the feds weren't headed up by an overt racist for whom is J. Edgar Hoover, federal charges and a genuine federal investigation would have happened when Mamie Till-Mobley first requested. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And part of the reason why that didn't happen is because, as I mentioned, Edgar Hoover was running he was over the feds, and he was an absolute bigot. That's not an opinion. You can see that very clear in a lot of things he said that is now available for public consumption. Going back again to that confession, it speaks to the ideologies that persisted in the day. that frankly, it was okay to dehumanize Black folk at whatever cost and price. And sometimes you can even get paid for it. And so with that, what a lot of what was shared in that Look magazine article, a lot of it is, again, it was done just to be able to say, well, these two did it, end of the story. When in fact, we know that, they weren't the only two. And, that's nowhere near the end of the story.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more. This next one is kind of a big one, so we'll see how much time we have left. What do you think is the best way to combat the false narrative of critical race theory being projected by reactionaries in this country?
Oh, wow, that's a really great question. So my opinion is this. I believe it's extremely important that when it comes to quote unquote critical race theory, we're very careful to not operate from a notion of theory of any sort when we look at this thing. Now, this is why I say that. When we use critical race theory, you create this, I'm gonna say, a nexus of whys and why nots, and hows and how nots. If I share with you objective history, that's not a theory. If or when I share with you very matter of fact points of local history that again tie directly to things that are not to be debated when it comes to what is, then I'm not dealing with it. I'm dealing with objective information. Another way to put that is I'm dealing with the truth. It's my personal belief, and I think it's also a shared belief with the center that racial reconciliation begins with telling the truth. The truth is, even the term critical race theory has become unbelievably politicized and unbelievably, it's become a pun in spaces or in the space of the necessity of truth to this coming generation. And now you have folks who have the responsibility of positioning people to think critically, not theoretically, but think critically, to question and sometimes absolutely oppose the very notion and thought of sharing already widespread, widely accepted facts and truth. Now, when we talk about, again, depending on how it's perceived, a person can or will villainize critical race theory. And I think there's this fear that what's going to be taught is hate of some sort, or division of some sort, or the pushing in or condemnation of people, of white folk or whoever, other folk. Those monikers and many others have kind of fallen in this umbrella of critical race theory and saying, now, well, that's not good or that's not right, or you even hear other buzzwords like that's unpatriotic. Well, I would dare say it's an assault against patriotism to not be truthful. Like, as an American, for whom I believe, am the progeny of enslaved folk, I think it's absolutely wrong for us not to position children of any and every complexion to see clearly and responsibly how we got to where we are, why we do the things we do, and what steps we can take, today to be better. If you're not being introduced into reality in the classroom, then frankly, when it comes to public ed or when it comes to education, period, we're really doing a disservice to each other, because these young folks are going to come up. They're not just our future leaders; they're the leaders in training. And if we're not doing what we can and should do to position them to just simply take the information and think about it, and not just regurgitate stats and facts, and not just perform on a test, or not just to pander to the thoughts and beliefs of any system or even to an individual, but genuinely give them the tools needed to look at the world that they really truly live in and then create their own conclusions around that, but have that be founded and rooted in the truth, not in biases or not in bits of any sort, but just in hardcore facts that are often taught after you get out of K through 12 settings. I think the sooner we position folks to know the truth, the sooner people will be more willing to not politicize something that absolutely impacts every one of us, no matter how we identify. So yeah, I mean that's kind of where I stand with that. Is that it's one thing to say, one thing to use this term, right, critical race theory, and to demonize it or even uplift it and praise it. But it's another thing to just really say, hey, are my children being taught the truth around anything, right, around anything historical? And if they are, what sources are being used to share this? And how objective is the educator and the district when it comes to positioning people to think? Because if you can't give clear answers to that, you got more to worry about than any moniker or any phrase when we talk about the realities of Western society and America as a whole.
Great. All right, we have one final question, kind of a cool down question after that one. What are some other resources, books, websites, et cetera, that the Interpretive Center would recommend to share history, in addition to the two that we mentioned earlier, the Death of Innocence and the Murder That Shocked the World?
Yeah, great question. So I'll say a book that I think is really good for like middle school students or for students that are now kind of coming from going into adolescence, not necessarily ready to really dive much deeper, or as you're preparing them to dive much deeper. I think one book to uplift would be Simeon's story. So the late Simeon Wright actually wrote a book some years ago about kind of his own life, and absolutely that includes the events concerning the Emmett Till tragedy. But it also kind of gives you a peek into the life of Mose Wright, his father. So seeing this relatively, I don't want to say a small book, but I think a book that can be consumed by folks in the middle school age group is a good introduction to this narrative, and it's also a good introduction into of what life looked like for Black folk that sharecropped and otherwise in the 50s, well, in the early 20th century. Let's see what else. Some other resources. You also have, so you have a documentary that was done, I think, back in 2001 by Keith Beauchamp, which is the untold story of Emmett Till. I would encourage as many people as possible to take some time and pull that up. You can literally find it on YouTube now. But again, so that's the not the Death of Innocence. That is the untold story of Emmett Till. It's really, in my opinion, really good because you're hearing the words of now the late Mamie Till-Mobley, but you're also hearing the words of Reverend Willa Parker. You're hearing the words of the late Simeon Wright. You're hearing, the thoughts of these folks who are not just witnesses, but they are survivors in their own right. So to see that captured, by documentarian Keith Beauchamp is, I think that's a really good thing, and I think it can be used in a number of settings, whether it's just for a person, an individual that's wanting to just kind of learn a little bit more, or hear more from folks that are part of this narrative, absolutely so. Or even for educators, right? Or other people that are in institutions where they have to kind of, where information exchange is kind of part of what they do. Hearing, again, when we look at this narrative, hearing the words and thoughts of folks that are part of the narrative is irreplaceable, and you can't put a price tag on that. So you get that, and a good deal of that can come from looking at Keith Beauchamp's documentary, and the name of that being, wow, come on, Miss Saulsberry, The Untold Story of Emmett Till. So websites. There are a number of websites. Of course, I'm going to do a plug for ours being emmett-till.org. You can learn a little bit more about our organization, some of the programmatics that we're working towards. But I also want to uplift, the Emmett Till, the tillnationalpark.org Now, I'm uplifting this not just because we're kind of on the grounds working to seek a national park designation for sites tied to the Till narrative. I'm uplifting it because there is credible, vetted information around around the sites that are part of this narrative. I think a lot of those sites are in Mississippi, but I think there are also some in the Chicago area or Illinois area. So yeah, you got tillnationalpark.org, you got emmett-till.org. You also, by all means, download the Emmett Till Memory Project app. Okay, this is an app that was created really in response to the continued vandalism of the commemorative markers. The folks that created it, one of whom being Dr. Dave Till, who's a scholar in his own right, and an author, as a matter of fact. He, along with, I think, Kansas, I want to say Kansas, was it Kansas State University? Feel free to vet me, and if I'm wrong, I'll be first to admit I'm wrong even before y'all find out I'm wrong. But the app, again, the app gives historical context to a number of sites that people can visit on their own time. So it's available for both Android and Apple operating systems. It's free, so there's no charge for it or anything like that. But it is it's a tool, like it is a genuine resource to use when we're looking at or thinking about like the homes that Emmett and Mamie Till-Mobley lived in. When we look at Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ, which was the place where the funeral was held. When we think about Argo, which was the plant in Summit, Illinois. There's context and historical write-ups, accurate historical write-ups, and on those locations and a whole host of other ones. And it's even and it's under and every few years they update it and try to kind of add more information to it periodically, things of that nature. So that is a resource that can literally be in the palm of your hand. The Emmett Till Memory Project, ETMP. Again, available for both Android and Apple operating systems. I'm sure there are other ones, but like those are just some of the ones just off the top of my head that we use and or encounter and exchange with other folks, on a regular basis over the last few years. You got the app, you have those books. So that's Indian Story, Devery Anderson's account, Death of Innocence, and then you also have the documentary from Mr. Keith Beauchamp, The Untold Story of Emmett Till. I mean, and now to some extent, we now have like Women of the Movement, but also remember, there are creative liberties in Women of the Movement. So within a grant, within the scope or constellation of the resources, it's great. But also, be willing to continue to do further vetting. Oh, last but not least, you can find the FBI transcripts of the investigation. I think I want to say 2004 or 5 investigation on Google. Like literally, you Google it, type in like Emmett Till transcripts, and what you're gonna pull up, I believe it's from Square. Y'all don't make me lie because I could be wrong, but I'll tell you the one I've used on several occasions. Whichever one has around, I want to say it's like 450 some odd pages concerning the investigation of Emmett Till, or rather the murder of Emmett Till. That's going to include a lot of content, or not a lot, but content of the areas, being Tallahatchie County and LaFleur County and Sunflower County, right? The demographics of the time, like the census numbers, things of that nature. It's going to talk about the various persons within that investigation and or part of the narrative. I believe some of the trial, if not the lion's share of the trial, is part of that. But then also just other components that don't sometimes get highlighted in conversation. That is it's on Google. You just type in Emmett Till transcripts, and you should see something from I think Square. It's a PD. It's available. I mean, you can download it as a PDF, and it has literally about 450 some odd pages. There may be another one that's even more comprehensive, but that's the one that I'm familiar with, or most familiar with. And yeah, that kind of rounds it out with just resources just off the top of my head that are like absolutely tied to the Emmett Till narrative.
Thank you again to Benjamin Saulsberry and the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. I hope you all have a great evening.